Hello and welcome to my presentation where I will express my interpretation of abnormal psychology pertaining particularly to Paulina within the play Death and the Maiden by Ariel Dorfman, before discussing my own work of visual art based on her experience with trauma. So, a little bit about the historical context of the work. This play is written in response to Chile's collective struggle to return to democracy during the 1990s following Augusto Pinochet's totalitarian dictatorship. Under the pretense of national reformation, this military regime entailed an abundance of human rights violations where 28,000 were tortured, 2,000 executed, 1,000 went missing, and 200,000 were forced into exile. But why do we care about historical context? This is massively relevant to Ariel Dorfman's play because this work is largely allegorical. Paulina's traumatic experiences become a synecdoche for the momentous human rights violation enacted on innocent civilians at the time, and her mental illness and cognitive dissonance a metaphor and analogy for the resulting turmoil and general unrest within Chile. It is therefore vital to recognize Paulina herself as an archetype of the many just like her. As such, this work has great historical and sociological value, in that Paulina's own trauma and mental illness allow insight into the collective struggles of a damaged nation in reform, quintessential of why in fact we study literature in the first place. A victim of exile himself, Dorfman's whole life has been dedicated to saying, "I will not be silenced," using literature to emulate the hardship he and his people endured in a motive and meaningful fashion, thus criticizing and warning against totalitarianism. Just like Paulina, he refuses to be silenced that his voice may once again come home. First things first, it's important to recognize this play as a work of trauma literature. Psychological trauma is essentially a deeply distressing or disturbing experience when an overwhelming amount of stress exceeds the victim's ability to cope and deal with the emotions involved. Paulina's abuse commences as three men, stick a gun in her back and threaten to, blow her away. Here, a gun and the violence it symbolizes who the lethal power administered to its wielder constitute literally and figuratively an overwhelming power disparity so extreme that in, that first moment Paulina was defeated, already overwhelmed. This exemplifies power disparity on a national level, where civilians are at the complete mercy of the government, subject to the desires of power-hungry fascist Augusto Pinochet. Paulina's doctor arrives later, along with wonderful music juxtaposing this sensory deprivation as her body falls apart. Paulina's affinity for Schubert's Death and the Maiden leads her to believe that he would save her. However, this doctor's mask of virtue quickly gives way to a sadistic curiosity that was partly morbid, partly scientific, and Paulina is dehumanized to a lab rat and labeled a cunt, attributing value solely to her genitalia and her participation in agonizing sexual experiments. The cruel irony of Paulina's belief that a man would somehow rescue her, coupled with how this, doctor paradoxically likens sadistic totalitarian abuse to, medical care, emulates the false humanitarian pretenses of national reform the regime claimed to operate under. As a direct consequence of this abhorrent altercation, Paulina seems to suffer from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, a mental illness that manifests about half of rape victims, where memories of trauma impair everyday functioning. Paulina recalls Death and Maiden being played, over and over again, such that it became a trigger, a stimulus that evokes a reaction based on association to trauma, and how, at a later date, contact with this piece caused her to be, physically sick. That a pure sensory experience could cause such an extreme involuntary biological reaction demonstrates both how ingrained her trauma has become into her, and thus the control it exerts over her behavior, and, on an allegorical level, the pure significance of collective national suffering, causing change on an methodological level, impacting the very culture of Chile. Intense paranoia also constitutes Paulina's unstable temperament, demonstrated as she, hurriedly stands up and takes out a gun upon merely hearing the distant sound of a car. Dorfman uses dramatic irony to depict her gun as an instinctive coping mechanism. This paranoia and desperate means to avoid trauma echoes the residue fear within Chilean population of returning to a system of authoritarian dictatorship abundant with trauma of all kinds. To many of us, the notion of what is real is not a major factor in everyday cognition, but to those with schizophrenia, a mental disorder characterized by disassociation from reality, it results in very atypical behavior, socially and cognitively. Paulina herself exhibits numerous symptoms of schizophrenia to such an extent that she is branded, almost prototypically schizoid by Roberto, the immediacy of this diagnosis establishing Paulina as an archetype. Occasionally, Paulina is seen to demonstrate the so-called flat effect, that is, a lack of emotional expression, her disposition, very calm as she addresses Roberto the first time, so unperturbed that she, points a gun playfully in his direction, trivializing the deadly potency of the weapon and portraying an inability to recognize the seriousness of her reality. This indifference juxtaposes her reoccurring hysteria and represents, to some extent at least, an inherent affinity within mankind, even within trauma survivors, towards power through a newfound comfort and outward fearlessness brought on by the gun, a motif symbolizing power, such that we better understand the motivation of the regime. This indifference may also communicate the methodical nature of justice, albeit vigilantism here. On the other hand, a damaged perception of pleasure is exemplified through an inability to enjoy sexual intercourse, where her likening, quote, the possibility of an orgasm building to, quote, currents going through her body, references sadistic experimentation upon her, and bespeaks an inability to separate consensual sex from sexual abuse and thus reality from memory, pleasure from pain. This tactile delusion due to trauma impairs Paulina's basic biological functioning, and even her ability to reproduce on an allegorical level represents a deep-rooted effects of recent history on societal functioning. Quite the contrast, yet in some ways aligned to Paulina's schizophrenia and dissociation with reality, is the idea of the truth versus the real truth, and even the real truth, appearing in their order throughout the play. The idea that any one of these may not align with each other is a paradox, but in the context of Paulina's schizophrenia, this diction emulates many perceptions of the truth, how hers differs from Gerardo's, just as court testimony from one witness may contradict that of another. And the idea that truth is revealed in layers, just as human rights violations in Chile surface to the commission one by one. An interesting addition to the play is the scene in which the viewers come into contact with a, quote, giant mirror which descends, forcing the audience to look at themselves. An analogy where the mirror reflects their true concrete appearance, but only represents a tiny fraction of their identity, a phenomenon so multifaceted that it has infinite layers, most deeper and more abstract than meets the surface, linking back to this fundamental question, what is real? In keeping with the theme of truth and its juxtaposition of schizophrenia as that of closure, just as Chile must heal from its past to reform into a democracy, Paulina must find a way to heal from her own trauma. Psychological closure is in its simplest form an answer to an ambiguous situation, enabling one to move past it. While Chile appoints a commission to investigate, quote, human rights that ended in death, or the presumption of death, which is in fact no use to Paulina and furthermore invalidates her suffering, Paulina appoints a vigilantes court to extract a confession from Roberto, these two courts becoming an extended metaphor in the ways they parallel each other. Abandoning her, quote, eye for an eye philosophy and plans to rape Roberto in favor of knowledge, Paulina realized closure as opposed to revenge alone would, quote, liberate her from her phantoms. This new philosophy echoes that of Gerardo's commission, where the focus is that, quote, everything comes out into the open, although the perpetrators are, quote, covered by amnesty and cannot face any real repercussions. That knowledge takes precedence over justice in both vigilante and more politically correct courts, bespeaks a collective, incessant need for recognition and acknowledgement of suffering, linking to Dorfman's motivation in writing the play in the first place. On the other hand, psychological research by Kruklansky et al. Has proved greater need for closure results in greater potential for delusion, particularly relevant to schizophrenic Paulina. Thus, yet another paradox appears where her opportunity to heal from trauma may be invalidated by her resulting mental illness. Delusion predominantly manifests through heavy confirmation bias. Paulina's tendency to interpret insufficient evidence as confirmation of her existing beliefs, exemplified through refusal to even acknowledge the possibility, quote, he has nothing to confess. Paulina lacks jurisdictive credibility through her purely sensory, tactile, oral, and olfactory evidence, claiming to recognize, quote, his skin, quote, his voice, and, quote, his smell, dismissed by Roberto as, quote, fantasies of a diseased mind. This allows insight into the true difficulty faced by the Commission, where occurrences that may well be true cannot be substantiated with concrete, credible evidence, Gerardo's first taste of the ambiguity to ensue in his role. There is a certain reluctance in both Paulina and Gerardo to recognize and acknowledge Paulina herself as mentally ill and a survivor of trauma. Paulina's blunt retort, quote, I'm not sick, to Gerardo's reminder of her illness indicates shame on one level, and on another that her psychiatric issues are to some extent egocentric, that she doesn't recognize issue with them, going so far as to command Gerardo that, quote, he be reasonable, foreshadowing the demands of many others like Paulina, who the Commission and thus Gerardo are likely to face. Gerardo's reluctance to transform the abstract concept of trauma to real-life events surfaces as Gerardo trails off while saying, quote, 15 years ago, someone, needing to be prompted profusely to, quote, say it now, simply to admit, quote, they tortured her, and yet after more prompting that, quote, they raped her. Gerardo trivializes Paulina's suffering as he apologetically bids Roberto to, quote, humor her, for, quote, when crazy people have power, you've got to indulge them. This trivialization omnipresent through reoccurring diminutives such as, quote, silly girl, my baby. This not only demonstrates an inability between the neurotypical Commission to fully empathize with the neuroatypical trauma victims, but perpetuates societal stigmas on mental illness and its validity. Also relevant to Gerardo's trivialization of Paulina's needs is how his diction characterizes her as being fragile. As Gerardo suggests Paulina might, quote, die from an excessive dose of the truth, he hyperbolizes her temperamental disposition, providing insight into the complex task of exposing truths as it pertains to Chilean politics, while the Commission goes about cautiously investigating sensitive issues in a, quote, limited manner so as to minimize upset. Schubert's Death of the Maiden itself brings a different type of allegorical meaning to this play. Written in 1823 during Schubert's suffering with terminal tertiary syphilis and upon his realization of his imminent death, Schubert's Death in the Maiden, based on proximity to death and reflecting his mental suffering, parallels much of Paulina's. In a letter to his friend, Schubert writes, quote, "Think of a man whose health can never be restored, and who from sheer despair makes matters worse, instead of better. Think, I say, of a man whose brightest hopes have come to nothing, and his enthusiasm for the beautiful is fast vanishing, and ask yourself if such a man is not truly unhappy." Expressing struggles that parallel Paulina's, who too wallows in self-pity and whose hopes and aspirations to practice medicine too have come to nothing, as, quote, "she didn't get too far with her studies." Visual representations of Death in the Maiden also feature heavily in art history, derived from Dance of the Death, and developing an erotic subtext over time. Notable in pieces include those by Edvard Munch, on the cover of our copies, Egon Schiele and Hans Baldung, which coincidentally has actually been stored in Basel. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my oil on canvas, aptly titled Death in the Maiden, where I have taken inspiration from arts and musical history and created a visual work to depict Paulina's experience with trauma. The relevance of death itself to my work stems from death's beckoning of a young, innocent maiden in the lyrics of Schubert's work, and corresponds with Paulina's own proximity to death, a huge factor of trauma and how it overwhelms her. Also, death serves to represent ultimate power, as death inevitably and irrevocably comes for us all sooner or later. The most striking aspect of this piece is its unseemly sexual vulgarity, which emulates the play's own vulgarity in its scene language, particularly the word cunt, arguably the most offensive word in the Old English language, and other frequently averring taboos, featuring explicitly throughout the play. Death's molestation of a young woman purposely evokes feelings of unease, designed to mimic the audience's reaction to the play in its lewd sexual content, this non-consensual contact representing Paulina's unwanted attachment to death. However, the nude figure of a woman also establishes a sense of vulnerability to the maximum bodily exposure humans may display, and thus innocence, for we are all born naked and completely free of guilt. This innocence is key to understanding Paulina as a victim and undeserving of her trauma, perfectly illustrated as she laments to Gerardo, quote, "Why does it always have to be people like me who sacrifice?" The bright red background serves to strengthen the viewer's unease, this colour prone to evoke anger, as after all we tend to see red when furious. It also contrasts with the completely monochrome and thus lifeless corpuscle form of death and Paulina's olive Chilean skin. This, coupled with its association to blood, lust, violence, and sexuality, only accentuates the graphic scene it surrounds. Because of the solid background, Paulina appears to be floating, this aspect communicating the omnipresence of Paulina's connection to trauma, that her psychiatric issues remain with her regardless of setting. As Gerardo puts it, quote, "She's still a prisoner locked in that basement, but merely psychologically, not physically, as represented through the lack of chains, bars, or anything else to that effect." It also represents her isolation, portrayed in the play through dramatic irony as we glimpse her alone, appearing to be quite drinking the light of the moon. This reference to alcoholism, insinuating her trying to, without help, escape her demons, represented by death here. The ring ties into this, where, quote, "Gerardo's name stayed inside her during her interrogation, no matter what, her loyalty juxtaposed with Gerardo's infidelity, and him as an incompetent support system." The last predominant aspect of my artwork is the fact that Paulina's face is covered by the distorted image of the Chilean flag. Not only does her facelessness portray her as an archetype, it also dehumanizes her as the property of and thus a pawn in the regime. It also references cognitive dissonance through its distortion and sensory deprivation, as the flag of Chile covers and metaphorically suppresses all her sensory organs. In closing, I would encourage you all to recognize the true literary value of trauma literature, such as Death in the Maiden, in expressing suffering, where literary devices facilitate a more conceptual understanding of abnormal psychology. I hope, too, that you take away from this presentation a heightened sense of empathy for those like Paulina who have lived through trauma of all kinds, from political oppression to rape and captivity, suffering we will never likely experience in our lifetime. Thus, I would like to conclude my presentation with a thought, a quote very relevant to trauma, by Laurel K. Hamilton. "There are wounds that never show on the body, that are deeper and more hurtful than anything that bleeds." Thank you.